Before its release 2 years ago, I had high hopes for The Division. I loved the thought of an open-world Manhattan. I'm a sucker for post-apocalyptic stories, and I'm also a longtime fan of Tom Clancy games and their tactical combat. So, like some, I was disappointed when I finally played it. Instead of a seamless open world to explore with my friends, I found the skeleton of a game built around an artificial loot grind. What's more, that loot grind wasn't all that rewarding or even fun to begin with. I was completing fetch quests and shooting bullet sponge enemies over and over again. Lastly, I felt as if developer Massive Entertainment had failed to use its premise to good effect. Playing as peacekeeping agents sent into a post-outbreak New York seemed like a springboard for grim storytelling, but here too the game fell flat. Characters were cheesy, and any interesting questions Massive raised were brushed aside in favor of loot and boring reasons to find it. Suffice it to say, I bounced off The Division hard. But of course, the game was a commercial juggernaut. It was the most successful new franchise to date, selling $330 million in its first 5 days, eclipsing Bungie's Destiny by $5 million in the same period. Whatever problems I had with the game didn't seem to register with a huge number of people. And those numbers have only grown. Just 2 weeks ago, Ubisoft announced that The Division had accrued 20 million total players. Much like Ubisoft Studios have done with Rainbow Six Siege and Ghost Recon Wildlands, they've constantly supported The Division in its post-release months. Its popularity has allowed the team to implement continual updates, and those updates have kept increasing the game's popularity. It's a symbiotic relationship that has morphed The Division into something very different than its original form. And of course, just recently, Massive announced it will be showing The Division 2 at E3 this year. A sequel was inevitable for the most successful new franchise of all time, but still, it piqued my curiosity once again. I decided to finally give The Division a second chance, to see how it had changed, to see whether I could embrace it for what it is and not what I want it to be. So, this is my experience with The Division, 2 years and 20 million players later. Let's get the biggest roadblocks out of the way up front. The Division is still a grind. It is not a tactical shooter, its open world is not teeming with memorable characters and revelatory secrets. It is still largely focused on pushing you through a gameplay loop of traveling, shooting, looting, and crafting. It is still Ubisoft's main attempt to rival lifestyle games such as Destiny. But only 2 hours into my recent playthrough, it was apparent just how much more variety there is this time around. In your search for loot, you can hunt down bounties, clear contaminated areas, extract virus samples, and defend allied checkpoints. That's not to mention endgame content such as high-value targets, the wave-based resistance mode, the 4v4 skirmish arena, the randomized underground missions, or server-wide global events. Some of these were paid DLC, while Year 2 expansions were all free updates. The Division is still very much a grind, but in general, that grind is now much more fun.
Water pressure's back to normal. We're good for now. Thanks.
The process is also much more rewarding. Enemies constantly drop items useful for your character rank. As I worked to increase my endgame ranking, I was getting new rewards for everything I did. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't get attached to your favorite loot. In Update 1.3, The Division added the Recalibration Station, allowing you to re-roll item stats to better suit your character. This seemingly minor addition is actually huge. It lets you keep gear with high armor rating without sacrificing the build you're working toward. I can have my cake and eat it too. All in all, The Division does a much better job of letting me play how I want. There are certain activities that will undoubtedly provide better loot drops, but in the long haul, any time I spend with The Division will likely improve my character. There are more ways to get loot, there are more ways to customize my playstyle, and there are more ways to explore this crumbling Manhattan. When it comes to The Division's game world, I'm torn. I agree with many that there is wasted potential here. A diseased New York, perpetually covered in holiday decorations, with warring factions trying to survive, it's a dream premise for many writers. Sadly, that story never really flourishes. Its factions, for instance, have some of the weakest motivations I can imagine. The city's sanitation workers all came together as the flamethrower-toting cleaners. They walked the city, burning everything in sight, people included, hoping to rid the world of the new plague. The Rikers, on the other hand, are all escaped convicts from the infamous Rikers Island prison. They formed beneath a murderous leader, hoping to use their criminal ways to claim New York for their own. If you're thinking this all sounds ham-fisted, I agree. Furthermore, the game had the opportunity to ask questions about whether you and your fellow Division agents are actually the good guys. You're sent in to maintain the government during the collapse, and you're given free rein to kill anyone threatening that agenda. But anytime the Division approaches tougher subject matter, it stumbles, opting instead to justify your actions in service to the greater loot grind.
And I've got a hell of a lot more than good intentions. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna do it the right way.
All of this being said, though, I am thoroughly impressed by the world design itself. It's not on par with Los Santos or Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, but as far as settings go, Massive's Manhattan is beautiful in its modern desolation. It's also remarkable how well the game manages to fit a third-person cover-based shooter so fluidly into this world. Each street is a potential ambush point, every alleyway a good sniper's line of sight. Massive's New York comprises a multitude of smaller shooter arenas sewn together into one seamless whole. It's hard to ignore the craft on display here. And this all brings me to the Dark Zone. What was probably the game's main attraction before release soon became a source of headaches for players and developers alike. The center of Manhattan was the only original PvP arena in the Division, allowing agents to farm high-end loot while also teaming up with or betraying other human players. Doing the latter meant going rogue, essentially painting a target on your back and making you a lucrative bounty for gear-seeking players. A major problem with all of this was balance, or lack thereof. At first, the penalties for dying as a rogue agent were so steep that almost no one ever risked it. As new updates rolled out, those consequences softened. However, each new update brought a new wave of cheaters who exploited the game for seemingly impossible loot drops. By entering the Dark Zone with extremely unbalanced gear, these players pretty much ran the PvP arena without any real opposition. Toss in the fact that all you had to do to go rogue was to shoot another player, and the Dark Zone became a chaotic nightmare. Players were jumping into my line of sight, forcing me to become an outlaw against my will, shortly before killing me and claiming their bounty. Thankfully, the recent update 1.8 fixed that problem. To go rogue now, you have to notify other players before attacking them. This may sound sort of goofy and gamified, but it works well. The tension and mind games that accompany loot extractions are still tantalizing as ever. Not knowing whether someone will help you fend off AI enemies or turn on you at the last second is downright terrifying. It's an intriguing look at your trustworthiness and your ability to trust in this chaotic environment, full as it is with legendary gear ripe for the taking. There are still balance issues in the Dark Zone, as many players will inevitably have better weapons than others, but the changes Massive have made give me hope for the Dark Zone in the sequel. In fact, the entirety of the Division feels like an ambitious experiment finally yielding results. The more time Massive and Ubisoft have spent with it, the more they seem to understand what makes it tick, and the more they can shape it into something unique. It's one of those series that feels on the cusp of excellence, if only it could take those last few necessary steps. I just hope Massive avoids the missteps Bungie recently made in making a sequel that didn't seem to learn all that much from its predecessor. For several months after Destiny 2's release, it felt as if Bungie ignored the progress they had made with the first game's patches, updates, and expansions. I don't mean to keep kicking Destiny while it's down, it just feels as if Bungie takes one step forward for every 2 steps back. And while we're on the topic of similar games, it's no secret that The Division takes cues from Diablo 3. Both are loot grinds, both have item recalibration, procedural late-game dungeons, and gear sets that lend more personality to your equipment. In general, both games are about finding loot, optimizing it, and using it to get better loot until you have the best items possible for X amount of time. But I think The Division is chasing Diablo 3 in a wider sense too. When it first released, Diablo's grind was far less rewarding than it is now. Players spent much more time seeking the specific gear they wanted, and unique items with noticeable abilities were few and far between. As the dungeon crawler evolved, however, the rewards became more constant. Legendary items had more personality, loot was more useful, and the time you spent was more likely to be worth it. Judging from the time I put into the Division's late-game content, it still has problems to fix before it reaches its full potential. Exotic items should stand out farther from the crowd, and they should help me more in my pursuit of specific character builds. But like Diablo, Massive has shown it can make the whole grind more rewarding. It just needs to capitalize in the sequel. The developers have already said they're making The Division 2 with all of their recent learning in mind. They've said they're using the new and improved Division 1 as a starting point for future success. I hope this rings true. I hope they pull it off. The Division is much better than I remember it being in 2016. And if Massive truly learned from this entire process, it might not take me 2 years to give its sequel the attention it deserves.